Right. Hello, everyone. I think we shall begin. First of all, salam and shalom here from Jerusalem. Yes, you will see that the Albright is open. We are functioning as per normal. Thank you, everyone, for all your emails and concern over the last short but burning hot conflict that Israel-Iran were in. The Albright is through that. We're all good. Things have returned to normal. We're open. We've got people in the hostel, and it is wonderful to be here. If you're passing through Jerusalem, please come and see us. However, as I'm sure you've all heard, that did mean we had to postpone our centennial event. So this year, 2025, is 100 years to celebrate the construction of the Albright building, or the opening of it. And rather than celebrating that in June, just as things were getting a little tense, we're now going to roll that celebration back and do it June 2026. So mark your calendars for June 27 next year. That will be our big centennial celebration. It would be wonderful for all of you to be here and to join us for that. So stay tuned on our website as we confirm some of those details. If you're planning a trip to Jerusalem, plan it around that and come and celebrate 101 years here at the Albright building. We will start resuming our normal academic program after the summer. So we will commence our normal lectures, etc., from the 1st of September as part of our usual fall academic program. And again, stay tuned as those details go up onto the website. It is a real pleasure today to introduce Nadia Ben-Marzouk, one of our NEH scholars who was in residence last year, and whose term as an NEH scholar was truncated given the first bout of conflict with Iran. And I know that this lecture has been postponed and postponed and postponed, given the unfortunate issues of, well, the regional issues that we all face. First of all, thank you, Nadia, for being so accommodating and being so gracious about this. We were really hoping to have Nadia give an in-person lecture in the Albright. In the end, we've just gone, okay, we'll do this as a Zoom event because we all want to hear what Nadia has to say, but we do look forward to welcoming her back to the Albright to resume her fellowship in due course. Nadia Ben-Marzouk is a lecturer at Loyola Marymount University. She previously got her PhD in Levantine archaeology at UCLA, and then was a postdoctoral researcher on the project Stamp Seals from the Southern Levant, which she held from 2021 to 2023. And that was a project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. Her research explores systems of craft production in the context of innovation in the Bronze Age East Mediterranean, with a focus on the identities, knowledge, transmission of expertise among the producers. Her NEH fellowship here at the Albright, as I said, was part of the 2024-2025 cohort, which was cut short in the round of tense hostilities back in the summer, fall last year. She was supposed to return to the Albright in the spring this year, but again, was not able to come, but we look forward, inshallah, to welcoming her back again, perhaps in the spring or the summer next year. But today's talk, what she's sharing, is about research that she undertook and that she completed while in residence here at the Albright as an NEH fellow. The talk is titled Crafting Communities into Contact, Contextualizing Glyptic Interconnections in the Levant, Egypt and Aegean, 2250 to 1550 BCE. Nadia, over to you to share your screen. Oh, and if there are any questions, put them in the chat and I'll ask them of Nadia at the end.
Okay, thank you. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay. First off, Thank you to Jamie and Michael for all of their help in making this lecture happen. It has been a long time coming. So as Jamie said, I'm interested in innovations, specifically the contexts in which innovations emerge and spread. And I tend to look at this through the lens of craft production and specifically of craftspeople, their skills, their knowledge, and the social networks in which they participated. Today's talk is part of a broader project that I'm working on that's exploring how craftspeople help shape an East Mediterranean exchange system during the late third to early second millennium. This wasn't just a period of trading goods, but it was very much a time marked by the movement of people, technologies, ideas, and shared practices. One of the innovations that I've been researching over the last several years is the emergence of new written scripts as a potentially interconnected phenomenon, born out of evolving and alongside a shared visual language that appears on Glyptic. So today I wanted to share with you some of this work and explore how Glyptic producers may have contributed to the formation of early writing systems in the East Mediterranean by seeking to bring a new contextual lens to Glyptic interconnections in the Levant, Egypt, and the Aegean. I'm going to do two case studies. The first one will look at the Aegean and Egypt, and the second one will look at the southern Levant in its broader East Mediterranean context. So to set the stage, for over a century, the nature of cultural contact and connectivity has taken a prominent place in scholarship, with Glyptic forming an important data set in these discussions. And the research is much too vast to list here, so I just list some of the prominent studies. Now, given their portability, previous studies have meticulously traced the appearance of motifs, materials, and techniques to demonstrate that by the late third and early second millennium, a shared visual language had very much crystallized on stamp and cylinder seals, highlighting the interconnectedness of the East Mediterranean and the importance of this data set. To illustrate these connections, I cite here the first example that Joan Aruz included in her 2008 study, showcasing the similarity in glyptic design from a seal at Asine in the Argolid Peninsula and at Mahazna in Egypt by the late third millennium. These studies were very much driven by questions related to what seals can tell us about the nature of cultural entities and regions, places, and peoples like the Minoans, the Egyptians, people from Anatolia, and people like the Canaanites in the southern Levant. Now, today I want to build from these works to complicate the picture a bit more and think about the role that craftspeople play in connecting and reconstituting communities, and how their interactions both at home and potentially abroad may have given rise to new scripts attested to on seals and amulets. Now, prior to 2000 BCE, the only known scripts in the Mediterranean were Egyptian hieroglyphs and hieratic in Egypt, and cuneiform at Ebla, very much part of the West Asian world. These are two writing systems that were graphically and materially distinct. Around the turn of the second millennium, as exchange networks intensified, something interesting happened, and that's that after centuries of just a few established scripts, several new writing systems emerge. In the northern Levant, we have what has been called a pseudo-hieroglyphic script at Byblos, inscribed on metal and stone stela. On Crete, the Archanes script or formula. And then Cretan hieroglyphs that appear on stamp seals and clay labels, while Linear A emerges about a century later. In Egypt and Sinai, early alphabetic inscriptions appear in mines, on metalworking and weaving tools, and on personal objects, also found in the southern Levant, where a pseudo-hieroglyphic script appears mainly on stamp seals. Now, despite their diverse geographic contexts, these scripts all share striking graphic similarities and seemingly appear within several generations of one another. Nevertheless, disciplinary siloing and a narrow comparative focus on Egyptian hieroglyphs have arguably underestimated the interconnectedness of the regional networks through which these scripts first emerged, obscuring both their entanglement within broader material worlds and shared practices and the potential connections that these scripts had to one another. So today I would like to ask, we're going to look at the Archanes script and Cretan hieroglyphs and pseudo-hieroglyphs in the southern Levant. Today I'd like to ask, how does an interregional practice-based approach to glyptic and script formation in the East Mediterranean during the late third to early second millennium help us better understand the possible factors impacting on their graphic development and varying levels of graphic interconnectivity. I will propose that new scripts arose out of a shared glyptic koine in the East Mediterranean that was very much rooted in a trans-regional community of practice. That glyptic producers were active members in that community, which required mobility to distant lands, and that the sharing of specific motifs suggests that women may have played a bigger role in the development of writing than we've typically acknowledged. I'll propose that these scripts should be explored within craft communities and the rise of a visual koine on seal amulets, reflecting a shared repertoire of symbols and practices that very much marked membership in this community, where the circulation, both the administration and production of textiles, played a major role. So let's first step back and ask, what does it take to create a script in the first place? What kinds of knowledge, both technical and social, shape how writing is designed and used? Scholarship typically divides scripts into primary inventions and secondary innovations, which adapt from existing scripts. Stephen Houston and Philippe Rojas model secondary script formation along a spectrum. At one end is accommodation, where gradual transformation of a writing system takes place. At the other, you have rupture, a rapid, very radical divergence between both signs and sounds. Now, in between is something called contrast, a relatively quick process that acknowledges a source script and also deliberately alters its graphemes. Now, this framework reminds us that new scripts develop through dynamic interactions, not mere imitation, so to speak, but rather adaptation within broader knowledge networks and various visual material traditions. So to understand their origins, we have to look beyond the signs themselves. As Kress and Van Leeuwen argue in their book Reading Images, representation emerges from the sign maker's background and the specific environment in which they work. So if we see graphic similarities across scripts, we need to ask what made certain sign shapes or forms successful enough to be adopted across different craft traditions. Where were producers encountering these signs? What networks were they embedded within outside of the idealized workshops that we often confine craftspeople to? To answer these questions, we can't just analyze the scripts, but we need to think about the producers themselves, their social interactions, and the material worlds in which they inhabited. Now, various texts from the early second millennium give us insight into the knowledge and social roles of skilled labor. At Kultepe Kanesh, merchant archives reveal figures like Puzar Ana, who was a first-generation metalsmith and merchant who also knew how to write, showing that literacy wasn't just confined to the domain of scribes. At Mari, palace archives document the mobility of skilled labor, specifically textile workers who stayed together, raising questions about how they exchanged practices, ideas, and visual forms of communication. In Egypt, from Abydos, you have the stela of Irtisen, who was an overseer of craftspeople who boasts about his ability to work in multiple materials, as well as his knowledge of hieroglyphs, highlighting the range of embodied knowledge that these artisans possessed. When it comes to glyptic producers, Unikambi argued portable trinket molds from the late third millennium showed how the diverse items cast from a single mold, things like jewelry, figurines, stamp seals, and amulets, were tied to different consumer communities stretching from Sipar to Western Anatolia. These molds reflect the movement of itinerant smiths along mobile trade routes, possibly using their wares as proto-currency, a pattern echoed in both archaeological finds and early second millennium texts from Kanesh, where Oya Topshualu has shown that seal carvers may have actually functioned or worked as metalsmiths, producing tools and weapons alongside cylinder and stamp seals, often sometimes in the same workshop, and even serving as legal witnesses in place of scribes. Similar patterns appear on Crete, where Emily Anderson has argued that glyptic specialists were highly mobile on the island, possibly procured their own materials, and even possibly engaged in textile production, a point to which we will return later in the lecture. Writing was thus deeply entangled with craft practice, rendering it as a form of technological interconnectivity. A cross-craft interaction framework helps us explore how writing systems developed through contact with other crafts like glyptic or weaving, influencing and adapting to one another. As Anne Briesberg defines it, a CCI framework involves, quote, the contact between two or more crafts with adaptive and/or adoptive behavior as a consequence, or with the influence of at least one craft upon another within an existing sociocultural system, meaning it's the way that crafts mutually influence one another. Alice Mandel's more recent craft literacy approach adds to this by focusing on how writing was learned and transmitted in workshop settings, based on an object's material and design. But to fully understand shared signs and visual forms across regions, we have to ask, where did producers encounter these motifs? And again, what kinds of social networks allowed signs to travel across different crafts, scripts, and regions? A community of practice approach proves invaluable for accessing the social worlds within which these individuals participated. Such a community forms when people sustain engagement around a shared domain, developing common practices, symbols, and artifacts tied to a context-specific group identity. This allows us to move beyond broad cultural labels and to focus on the joint endeavor. Why were people coming together? Markers of participation can include shared beliefs about how something should be made or used, like how a seal should be designed or how a script should look and function. At the core of this model is a concept known as situated learning, where participants move from peripheral to legitimate participants as they learn how the group kind of drives membership. So as they learn to become a full member within the community, meaning that this is not something that is formalized learning, but much more observational. A key aspect of a COP is its domain, right? The purpose that unites people and the diversity of its members, who often come from different ethnic, religious, and linguistic backgrounds and have varying degrees of experience. As new members join, the shared repertoire evolves, making room for innovation. Using a COP approach means looking not just at motifs or at script signs in isolation, but rather exploring the social communities in which producers participated and gave meaning to the things that we look at. So, with this in mind, I want to turn to our first case study, which is going to look at how interaction between Minoan seal carvers and maybe administrative elites in Egypt may have contributed to script formation on Crete. Cretan hieroglyphic is an undeciphered, possibly logosyllabic script made up of over 100 signs, though the actual signary is still being debated. It emerges alongside new administrative practices tied to the first palaces on Crete, roughly during the Middle Minoan II period. So we'll say something like 1900 to 1700 BCE. The script appears primarily on 3- and 4-sided prisms and pet shaft seals, and imported semi-precious hard stones, as well as on steatite seals, and inscribed into various clay documents that attest to its administrative function. Less understood is the so-called Arcana script of the preceding late pre-palatial period, which comprises the combination of a few signs, some of which actually appear later in Cretan hieroglyphic signary. These appear on bone seals, some of which are known to exhibit Egyptian influence. While Sir Arthur Evans noted some similarity between Cretan hieroglyphic and Egyptian hieroglyphs, both he and recent scholars favor a model of autonomous script invention, largely rooted in the material culture and glyptic tradition of Crete during the late 3rd millennium. While this visual corpus has long been part of broader debates about Aegean and Egyptian interaction, it has largely been sidelined in studies focused primarily on Cretan hieroglyphic. In the last 2 decades, 2 key studies have brought this material back into focus, and this is, apologies, these are button seals from Egypt, many of which Evans first noted seem to share some motifs as well as some forms with their contemporary Aegean counterparts. While this visual corpus has long been part of broader debates about Aegean and Egyptian interaction, as I said, it's been sidelined in discussions on the origins of Cretan hieroglyphic. In the last 2 decades, 2 key studies have brought this material back into focus, framing it within wider East Mediterranean networks and administrative symbolism, and suggesting it may hold untapped insights into the development of Cretan hieroglyphics. The first is Judith Weingarten's 2005 study, which I find very compelling, that some of the seal carvers from Crete traveled to Egypt and sustained engagement with provincial elites during the 6th through early 12th dynasties. Her proposal hinges on shared features found on locally produced glyptic on pre-palatial Crete and in Egypt, arguing that in the absence of imported Egyptian seals to the island, certain features would have had to have been seen by Minoan seal carvers. These shared features include things like the parading lion seal group, characterized by its figures, often lions that circumambulate the base of bifacial seals that were carved from Egyptian imported hippopotamus ivory. Sorry, we have a plane outside. The depictions of animals that are not native to Crete, but common in contemporary Egyptian contexts and amuletic repertoire, things like lions and seated monkeys. Tetbesh layout of many motifs, and the import and subsequent local manufacture of Aegean-style scarabs by the Middle Minoan I. Now, according to Weingarten, these shared features mark a distinct social identity on Crete that was forged very much through contact with provincial elites in Egypt, the proposed location of which she argues was possibly the Delta. While she didn't address how this kind of contact with Egypt might relate to the development of Cretan hieroglyphic, her work becomes especially important when placed alongside research by Roland de Court, who has made major contributions to our understanding of the visual and symbolic systems that came both before and during writing on Crete. In his study of pre-palatial glyptic, he identified 10 reoccurring non-figural motifs, shown here, that appear on 71% of all seals from the early Minoan II to middle Minoan I, roughly, we'll say 2500 to 1900 BCE. He argues these motifs formed what he calls an early glyptic vocabulary, meaning some sort of visual system that likely laid the groundwork for the emergence of writing on the island. Importantly, he also showed how several of these motifs appear on contemporary Egyptian stamp seals, linking them to a previously identified glyptic koine in the Balkans, Aegean, and Anatolia, and proposing the development of a broader East Mediterranean glyptic koine, where these signs likely operated as sematographs, meaning that their signs were communicating meaning without language. Of interest is that the mechanisms of transmission still remain underexplored, as do the significance of these motifs. When we combine these studies, it brings up two key questions. Can we identify additional motifs shared with Egypt as part of de Court's early glyptic vocabulary? And were Minoan glyptic producers limited to interaction with Egyptian elites in the Delta, or were they much more embedded in Egypt's wider administrative networks? My own reanalysis of the broader Egyptian material record demonstrates that many Cretan hieroglyphic signs emerged directly from a trans-regional system centered on body-worn administrative and ritual seal amulets, reflecting deeper integration, or possibly suggesting deeper integration, between Aegean and Egyptian administrative elites than previously recognized. The identification of additional iconographic motifs can be added to the repertoire and extends it into the Middle Minoan too, when Cretan hieroglyphic was forming. Meanwhile, stamp seal forms evolve in parallel across regions, 3 of which are employed for the earliest writing on Crete. Particularly illustrative are the seals and sealings of Balat, a provincial administrative center in Egypt's western desert that during the late 3rd millennium maintained administrative connections with the Nile Valley. At this site, administrative seal impressions incorporate local motifs, such as the lizard, into designs that closely parallel those from Aya Arini on the island of Kea in the Cyclades. We also find motifs from de Court's glyptic koine, such as the so-called four-armed whorl, shown here on local administrative sealings that closely resemble impressions from the House of Tiles at Lerna and the site of Asine in Greece. While these motifs are well known in the Aegean, they also appear on stamp seals from the Nile Valley, and notably, this motif specifically becomes a sign in Linear A, which was identified by Ferrara, Montecchi, and Valerio. At Balat, Laura Panalacci has shown that this motif is one of the 19 most frequently used in administrative sealings from the site, underscoring its importance. And we also see it on one face of a parading lion seal from Minoan Crete, where the reverse shows a design strikingly similar to yet another seal impression from Balat, as shown on the bottom. These formal overlaps aren't just coincidental. I would suggest that they reflect close engagement and possibly even direct collaboration between Aegean and Egyptian seal producers working within a shared administrative system. That has real implications for how signs gained meaning and functioned semiotically across these interconnected regions. This idea is reinforced by a hearth rim impression from the early Cycladic II at Aya Arini, where John Younger has controversially interpreted these motifs as imitations of Egyptian hieroglyphs found alongside a local sauce boat. The motifs include what appear to be the Egyptian hobble, sun disk, and possibly a duck. Signs known from Old Kingdom balance weights, as well as royal titulary like Sa Ra or Son of Ra. Other designs echo fenestrated axes as seen in merchant burials, suggesting that the seal producer may have been embedded in long distance exchange networks and familiar with Egyptian metrological or at least symbolic systems. Exposure to Egyptian writing in these contexts may have influenced how Aegean producers thought about visual signs, raising the possibility that early scripts emerged through sustained engagement with the visual authority of Egyptian writing, or at least signs connected to administration. We see more evidence for these connections back at Balat, where one seal impression shows an acrobat and a forked sign, as shown on top in red. All motifs are also found in pre-palatial glyptic on Crete. The forked sign was later formalized as Cretan hieroglyphic sign 19 and often appears with a double axe, Cretan hieroglyphic sign 42, a symbol also known from Egyptian seals. The acrobat in particular recalls Egyptian ritual performance, possibly by Henner troops associated later with the cult of Hathor. What's striking is how closely the Balat acrobat resembles figures on early and middle Minoan seals, so much so that it became formalized into the Cretan hieroglyphic signary, possibly became formalized into the Cretan hieroglyphic signary. While some scholars don't include the acrobat as an official sign, its reoccurring appearance alongside accepted signs suggests that it possibly functioned as a meaningful graph. These overlaps raise bigger questions, though, right? Where exactly did Egyptian and Aegean seal carvers interact? Were these motifs exchanged through trade, shared religious rituals, or administrative cooperation, or possibly all three? In trying to better understand the glyptic koine identified by Decourt, I began looking for parallels and quickly realized that Aegean scholars like Sophia Vikerzi, Olga Kay, and Fritz Blockelmeyer had already connected several motifs from Minoan glyptic to textile tools like spindle whorls or patterns stamped into loom weights across the East Mediterranean. Some of these same designs even appear as textile patterns on dresses from late Minoan frescoes. An obvious question hit me: could this shared glyptic koine have developed through the active participation of stamp seal producers in a trans-regional exchange network that was centered on textiles? A cross-craft perspective reveals strong and underexplored connections. Proposed here is that motifs from Decourt's early glyptic vocabulary gained island-wide significance through their relevance to Crete's emerging textile industry. This industry formed a key domain for sustained cooperation with provincial elites that fostered a trans-regional community of practice within which glyptic producers actively participated as central agents, likely negotiating and renegotiating what constituted this shared repertoire. Let's return to the parading lion seal group, which, as you may recall, has been interpreted as a body-worn emblem of emerging elite identity tied to the first palaces, but before the first palaces. While Weingarten linked the lion motif to the movement of seal carvers in Egypt, Emily Anderson offers a different, but I think very complementary perspective. She argues that many non-figural seal designs on the other side of these seals may actually encode stages of textile production, suggesting that glyptic producers were likely involved in textile work themselves. That insight becomes even more compelling when placed alongside the early glyptic vocabulary, where many of the same motifs identified by Anderson reappear, highlighting a deep connection between textile craft and the formation of new administrative identities and possibly script formation on the island. In fact, recent scholarship on the materiality of the Cretan hieroglyphic script has made a strong case that many of its signs, and indeed motifs, on contemporary glyptic are closely tied to the chanapatoire of textile production. We see signs that clearly reference the warp-weighted loom, tools for fiber processing, the spider as a symbol of spinning, as well as flax plants and cloth. All this points to the idea that textile production and exchange weren't just part of the economic background, but that they actively shaped how this script developed. So that brings us to the next question. How do these textile link signs connect to the Egyptian material that we've been exploring? For decades, it's been known that Egypt likely imported Aegean textiles by the early 12th dynasty based on Maria Shaw's study of the painted ceilings of Hebjeta, dated to the reign of Senwosret I. What hasn't been noted, however, is that the motifs and patterns embedded within this larger mosaic also appear on both Aegean and Egyptian stamp seals as part of this koine. Hopefully you can see the whole screen here. Okay. We also see a striking parallel between a Middle Minoan II rock crystal cylinder seal and the false door on the coffin of Ameni from Mer, dated to the 12th dynasty, pointing to the growing significance of Aegean textiles in Egyptian funerary culture by the early Middle Kingdom. Recently, Juan Carlos Marina Garcia argued that the governors of Middle Egypt were not just local officials, but also active players in an international textile trade during this period. This proposal becomes more significant when we consider the famous depiction of the Levantine A'amu traders in the tomb of Khnumhotep II at Beni Hassan. These figures are often associated with Levantine textile trade, and their brightly patterned garments closely resemble designs, however, that we also see on contemporary Minoan stamp seals. In Egypt, Elizabeth Barber has argued that women were primarily responsible for textile production during the early Middle Kingdom, with Middle Kingdom texts even mentioning elite households employing non-Egyptian women for textile work. So this raises an important question. Who exactly possessed these stamp seal amulets in Egypt, and what might their archaeological and social contexts reveal about their semiotic significance and possible connections to the Cretan hieroglyphic script? Archaeological evidence reveals that such stamp seal amulets were predominantly found in the tombs of non-royal women and children, but much less frequently with men, alongside other apotropia, largely in the Nile Valley, where provincial elites' tombs display these Aegean textile motifs linked to the glyptic koine, as well as at Baalat and in the Delta. Further dimension is added when viewed in connection with epigraphic studies. Now, Robin Gillam's study showed that non-royal women and some men were given the title Priestess of Hathor as part of state-building efforts to expand the royal cult in this agriculturally rich region during the late Old Kingdom and into the First Intermediate period, precisely which is when this glyptic koine begins to crystallize. Administrative elites likely controlled such arable land for flax production, while some women are said to have also served in the cult of Neith. This domain is reflected in the iconography of stamp seals, which display acrobats, dancers, and other apotropaic objects linked to childbirth and Hathoric symbolism, as has been shown in the studies of Ulrike Dubiel and Andre Weiss. Many of these seal amulets were made of white bone and hippopotamus ivory, which may have invoked Hathor's association with the hippopotamus. At Baalat, one woman was buried with a cylinder seal bearing the title Priestess of Hathor, emphasizing her administrative authority. When we consider the overlap in material and iconography between the Egyptian seals and those associated with the Cretan hieroglyphic script, not to mention the mobility of Minoan seal carvers, it raises a central and critical question. How might Minoan involvement in Egyptian administrative networks have shaped the development of script traditions on Crete? One especially vivid example of this link between Cretan hieroglyphic and the textile industry comes from a clay label found in Quartier Mew at Malia. It was discovered in an area where there were also over 100 loom weights pointing to active textile production. The label includes signs with clear Egyptian parallels. Cretan hieroglyphic sign 85, which resembles the Egyptian sign for a long sleeve garment known from the 6th dynasty at Nagadir. Cretan hieroglyphic sign 41, which matches the Egyptian cloth sign, and Cretan hieroglyphic sign 34, which looks like a rotated version of the 12th dynasty hieratic sign, mountain sign. Now, these links suggest that signs related to textile work and accounting played a key role in the development of the script as potentially a logographic script. And given the overlap with Egyptian hieratic, which we know are used in administrative contexts, It's likely that administrators on Crete were at least partly familiar with Egyptian writing. It's even possible that the inclusion of the plow sign as Cretan hieroglyphic sign 57 reflects relevance possibly to flax cultivation. When we place Cretan hieroglyphic in the broader context of a trans-regional community of practice, especially one tied to textile exchange, we begin to see just how graphically connected it is to apotropeia, reflecting Egyptian beliefs about birth and burial. Several Cretan hieroglyphic signs appear to be modeled after Egyptian seal amulets, including a seated figure with a raised arm, shown on the left, bent arms, hands with their thumbs extended, which appear on ivory clappers as well as different amulets, and straight legs. I also want to just pause here for a second and say that some of these motifs are known earlier in Crete, some are known earlier in Egypt. So in terms of directionality, it's bidirectional. This is a give and a take. So this is something that I look at in terms of reconstituting communities. While Egyptian hieroglyphs such as the bee and fly have been recently rejected as Egyptian in origin, given formal variation between what the Cretan hieroglyphic sign looks like and the Egyptian hieroglyphic sign looks like. So for example, in Cretan hieroglyphic sign 21, you see that the body of the fly comes down with its wings spread. If you were to compare it to Gardner L3, there's no body there. However, when you consult the archaeological record of stamp seal amulets, you find very similar graphic parallels, which mirror their pre-palatial counterparts, kind of further punctuating this shared repertoire. Additional graphic correspondence includes a frontal bovid head resembling the Bat or Hathor amulets, contemporarily strung anthropomorphic figures with their strings potentially shown, the Jed pillar, and spirals. Notably, the Egyptian material is seemingly a little bit earlier than the material that it correlates to on Crete. Cretan hieroglyphic signs also show striking connections to Egyptian birth tusks. These are apotropaic wands made of hippopotamus ivory used by elite women and wet nurses during childbirth, and also found in tomb assemblages connected potentially to rebirth. These objects are often decorated with fantastical creatures like Taweret, shown with long serpent tongues wielding knives. One sign in particular, Cretan hieroglyphic sign 18 on the left, depicts a beast with a protruding tongue that closely resembles Taweret and other leonine figures found on these wands. Even more compelling is that one of these seals shows this creature with the same angled line terminating in the frame that we see on Egyptian scarab with an image of Taweret. Another sign, Cretan hieroglyphic sign 45, resembles the knife held by these protective creatures, and in Cretan inscriptions. It appears both smooth and serrated, just like we see on variations of these Taweret seals. Other Cretan hieroglyphic signs that seem to derive from Egyptian birth tusks include a donkey head, full-bodied cats, and the so-called cat mask, which often appears rotated at the terminal end of Middle Minoan II seals, mirroring how a front-facing feline head is positioned at the end of these Egyptian birth tusks. In her study on Egyptiaca on Crete, Jackie Phillips even suggested that a seal amulet from the island may directly reflect the earliest attestation of the cat. However, when I look at it, it looks very much like this front-facing element at the end of these wands. Interestingly, Judith Weingarten has proposed that the Cretan cat sign may have functioned as a logogram, which is connected to wool in later scripts, which very much fits well with the textile connections proposed here. As these signs were being formalized into the Cretan hieroglyphic script, their role in a larger shared system connected to what looks to be Hathoric cult and parturition becomes increasingly visible. Other elements from this shared repertoire include, as Weingarten has showed, the introduction and subsequent transformation of Taweret, as well as Beset on Crete, both of whom appear on these ivory wands. as well as the so-called Hathoric curl, which appears connected to a broader West Asian practice of female fertility. The faience snake goddess from Knossos, whose local design can be linked to the Middle Kingdom wooden statuette of Besed and the magician's tomb at Lisht. An assemblage where ivory clappers, birth tusks, and the lion-headed goddess hold serpents and all co-occur. Also, we find the clay sistra used by henna dancers in Hathoric cult. When viewed in their wider social context, these motifs in media channel a localized yet recognizable visual grammar of protection and power, offering a potential new dimension to the Cretan hieroglyphic script. When viewed holistically and contextually, a large portion of the Cretan hieroglyphic signary appears linked to the material world of provincial Egyptian administration, adding significant nuance to previous assessments. These connections gain new significance when we consider that glyptic producers from Crete traveled to and participated in Egypt's administrative networks, likely as mediators of the island's expanding textile industry, which served as a new source of local power. The Cretan hieroglyphic script thus emerges not from an isolated invention or direct imitation, but rather as the outcome of a trans-regional process that was very much shaped in part by the participation of glyptic producers in a trans-regional community of practice that was centered on the production and exchange of textiles. The development of a body-worn glyptic koine highlights not only motifs, but also shared seal forms and material choices, indicating these networks played a key role in shaping early writing on Crete, as well as in the curation of a distinct social identity. The presence of Hathoric imagery as symbols of protection, fertility, and potentially the expedition community further grounds these seals and the script in a shared social and ritual practice, pointing to the potential but overlooked role of women in script development, a proposal that becomes unsurprising given these textile connections. Let us now turn to a much shorter and last case study and look at seals, pseudo-hieroglyphs, and the southern Levant. Egyptian-produced scarabs were first imported to the southern Levant and used in sealing practices during the first few centuries of the second millennium, a time when local stamp seal production is said to be non-existent. Shortly thereafter, amid settlement expansion and new administrative needs, thousands of locally produced stamp seals made of glazed steatite, faience, and semi-precious stones appear in the Middle Bronze 2 and 3, marking, the introduction of a regional glyptic production system. Daphne Ben-Tor studied these and found that early local designs were very much influenced by Egyptian late Middle Kingdom scarabs. For example, Canaanite seals marked with a C share similarities with their Egyptian counterparts marked with an E. Daphne suggested that local seal makers combined real Egyptian hieroglyphs with ones that also looked similar. She notes, quote, "These signs, which aren't found anywhere else, include both single signs and combinations. They don't form a coherent script or meaning," which led to the classification of these as pseudo-hieroglyphs. This has pretty much served the standard view. However, in examining these during my postdoc, I started to notice that some of the signs don't, as Daphne showed, don't appear in the Egyptian scripts at all. And so this led me to question, could they actually be used elsewhere when we consider the potential interconnectedness of script formation in the early second millennium? And I'll argue that they show pretty striking similarities to signs that are found in the Byblos script. Now, after I briefly look at similarities between these signs in the Byblos script, I'm going to shift to look at how some of the motifs on these locally produced seals also show connections to textile production and the Aegean. So looping back around to Crete. The Byblos script is an undeciphered linear script attested on 14 metal tablets, scepters, and stone stela, all lacking secure archaeological context from the site. While scholars generally agree it is a syllabary, the underlying language remains unknown despite various decipherment attempts. Its date of development is likewise uncertain, and its full sign repertoire, comprising over 100 signs, some of which are likely variants, still remains incomplete. In the absence of stratified contexts, paleographic comparisons with the Egyptian scripts have formed the foundation of dating proposals that have ranged anywhere from the 24th century all the way to the early first millennium. scarabs selected for paleographic analysis derived from Bentor's early Palestinian series and are attributed to southern Levantine production during the Middle Bronze too. The next few slides follow the same format. On the right-hand side, you have a Middle Bronze scarab with key signs highlighted. In the center, biblioscript signs, and on the left, their supposed Egyptian counterparts. I'm not going to go through every sign, but I'll flip through just to highlight a few paleographic similarities. Strikingly, many pseudo-hieroglyphic signs bear closer paleographic resemblance to signs in the biblioscript than their believed Egyptian hieroglyphic counterparts. Where Egyptian parallels do exist, their engraving on steatite aligns more closely with hieratic in some cases than with formal hieroglyphs, suggesting a connection possibly to lapidary hieratic that we see in Egyptian mining and quarrying contexts. Here we see a case where the paleography is closer to the biblioscript than the Egyptian counterparts. Here we can see a top sign appears as a decorative motif on some of these Middle Bronze scarabs, often identified as the Egyptian Kenbet sign, terminating in the border of the base. And we see, again, it's very similar how it almost mimics that angle sign that we see on the late Middle Kingdom seal showing Taweret, as well as that seal on Crete. Particularly interesting is the sign on the bottom, highlighting this distinct connection between hieratic forms, the biblioscript, and Middle Bronze Southern Levantine scarab producers. On Jericho 228, we see 5 signs with their closest parallels in the biblioscript. However, their similarity only becomes obvious when we flip the signs 180 degrees, as shown in the box. On a seal from Lachish, you actually see on top a sign with a loop and a vertical line, one of the most common signs in the biblioscript, but to my knowledge does not appear in the Egyptian scripts and shows up only on this seal from Lachish. What's important here is that all the signs on this seal are actually found in the biblioscript. And for the final example, a scarab from Megiddo features 8 signs from the biblioscript, seemingly forming an inscription in an unknown script. Some of these signs closely resemble those from a Middle Bronze II scarab found in Sidon, which bears a personal name and the epithet beloved of Seth. Eric Goubel and Henry Lafette argue that the scarab's shape and paleography suggest that it wasn't made by an Egyptian seal carver, but rather reflects a regional scribal tradition, perhaps one possibly outside of Byblos. Whether or not that's the case, the Megiddo seal is significant because of its similarities with the Sidon scarab, especially in the form of the reed leaf, the Seth sign, and the arm. We see further support for these connections in a locally produced scarab from Megiddo, which features 2 variants of the Egyptian Hasut sign, sign N25. Both variants also appear on a cylinder seal of the Hyksos King Khayan and on scarabs bearing the title Governor of Byblos, or Hatia and Keben, often alongside West Semitic names. These are all linked to royal Egyptian workshops operating in the Nile Valley and Delta. One distinct variant with a lower bar also shows up in the 12th dynasty tomb at Beni Hassan, where it labels the leader of an Amu caravan wearing those brightly patterned garments that we saw earlier, possibly being influenced by Minoan design. Now, this same title appears again in Byblos inscription L, so Hatia appears in Byblos inscription L, pointing to a shared set of administrative titles that extended from Egypt to the Levant. Yet these connections go beyond individual signs as they extend to how the seals were designed. The arrangement of signs in vertical columns with double-line dividers appears on both Byblos stela and Middle Bronze scarabs from the southern Levant. Some Byblos stela also outline their signs in the same way that we see on some of these Middle Bronze scarabs from the southern Levant. Signs that don't exist in the Egyptian scripts appear on both Byblos and Middle Bronze scarabs, as well as showcasing paleographic connections to hieratic for some other signs, kind of reinforcing a connection in networks extending from Egypt through the southern Levant up to Byblos. From a community of practice perspective, it looks like the same community was using these signs and arranging them in similar ways, which raises an important question. Have we overlooked this corpus in dating or complicating the script's development? Importantly, a number of the so-called pseudo-hieroglyphic signs on these scarabs show clear links to textile-related signs in Egyptian scripts, joining the number of locally produced scarabs that display various knots and threads, suggesting a possible overlooked textile connection. These include the hieratic sign for a spool without thread, the neath sign, often interpreted as thread, knotted cloth, a looped cord, and the menhet sign, whose hieratic form closely resembles actually sign 19 from the Cretan hieroglyphic scripts, and also a sign that was identified by Descartes as part of the Archanes script. In addition, two signs that don't have known Egyptian parallels but closely resemble signs in the Biblioscript also show textile associations. A threaded knot and two comb-like forms, the latter of which appear on a seal, both of which appear on a seal from Ginosar. Maria Nash and Agata Ulanowska have proposed that similar motif appear on Minoan seals and in Cretan hieroglyphic inscriptions, reflecting a thread and fiber combing or weft beading tool. Notably, the fiber combing tool appears to add a new layer of meaning to these so-called pseudo-hieroglyphs. And strikingly, that same comb-like sign traces back to the Archanes script in pre-palatial Crete, where Roland Descartes has identified it as a potential script sign. In fact, we see a number of overlooked connections as well to Minoan glyptic, which complicates this picture of producers in contact. These include similar bird-shaped people on the locally produced green jasper scarabs group that bear striking resemblance to such figures on Middle Minoan II glyptic, with figures shown engaging in weaving and flanking the tree of life. We also see couchant sphinx, caprids with branches, quadrupeds with the same half-circle motif with kind of internal lines terminating in the border. We see the same ladder motif dividing bases, twisted thread with these flanking motifs, a single branch embedded within a border, and the so-called Hathor curl, which might need to be renamed given its long-standing associations in West Asia. Of interest here, though, is this little semicircle, recalling the angle that we saw on Taweret seals and the seal from Middle Minoan to Crete with the beast with protruding tongue. Notably, this motif also appears all over locally produced seals in the southern Levant, raising the question of whether it's playing some sort of role in like a glyptic grammar. This element potentially played a semantic role based on its association in clear connection with the sistrum sign on the Archanes script, followed by, in the Middle Minoan II, by its appearance both in connection with the owl and embedded in, as you can see on the far right, an actual Cretan hieroglyphic inscription. Now, in the Aegean, X's appear as stictograms to indicate how to read a sign, potentially. So are we looking at something similar? Orly Goldwasser has drawn attention to the fact that during the 12th dynasty, contemporary with the owl seal, we see Hathor's name written with an owl inside the Hut sign. In Egyptian, you wouldn't use an owl, so Goldwasser has cogently made the case that perhaps this was a Canaanite rendering of her name, as we see it appear on a locally produced seal from the southern Levant. One such seal comes from a tomb at Cabri and is said to have been found strapped to the forehead of a child, reflecting a connection between Hathoric cult and children that we saw in the Nile Valley. This semicircle looks very similar to the angle terminating in the border. Oops, here we go. So I would raise the question, is it possible that it's functioning in the same way as the Kenbet sign on locally produced seals in the southern Levant? Notably, a number of seals made in the southern Levant reflect connections to Hathor, either directly from engagement in the Sinai mining landscapes or in their depictions of Henner troops and participation in the expedition community. But it wasn't just motifs shared with Crete and Egypt. It was also, when we compare practices, so going back to the southern Levant, not just looking at Egyptian iconography, but now looking at Minoan iconography and adding another layer by showing that a number of practices seem to have been shared with Minoan Crete. So we have stamped noduli, which Judith Weingarten has suggested perhaps came from administrative practice in Egypt. We also have stamped loom weights, which is a practice unknown in Egypt. And then we have stamped jar handles, another practice seemingly unknown in Egypt during this period. All of this to say that we are looking at shared administrative and craft practices related to the use of glyptic, administration, and textiles. When taken together, And here you have the same motif that we find on green jasper cylinder seals, which seem to have been made in the northern Levant. When taken together, these motifs and script comprise just one small part of the semiotic system and shared repertoire of a community of practice that included women as active agents of innovation who shared potentially projection-related knowledge. This is attested across geographically distinct communities where regional glyptic production systems were characterized by the same glazing and firing of steatite, molding of faience, and the use of specific drill heads to capture the concentric circles, as well as the same triple line thread motif in woven patterns. Even the same semi-precious hard stones were used for glyptic across regions, which requires the knowledge of certain drills and abrasives, as well as a newfound body memory. Almost done here. Southern Levantine scarab producers thus drew from a shared craft-based repertoire of administrative practices that extended across Egypt, Byblos, and Minoan Crete. Their engagement reflects participation in a trans-regional system linked to textile production, Hathoric cult, women's labor, and while new paleographic analysis highlights possible knowledge of hieratic, it also shows connections to Byblos script forms. These graphic and material parallels across scripts and seals support the view that Southern Levantine scarab producers were not passive imitators, but socially embedded, highly mobile artisans operating within a cooperative, trans-regional community of practice that linked Egypt to Byblos and likely beyond. Their active participation is inscribed in both the script and iconography of the scarabs that they produced, which bear the material traces of a shared geography of practice. So just some concluding thoughts. When we pull together the different regional threads, we weave a much more complicated picture than currently exists, one that raises new questions about the nature of contact between communities and the graphic worlds in which they inhabited and shared. As I've shown, these scripts appear to develop alongside a glyptic koine connected to the trans-regional trade in textiles, but also metal, semi-precious stones, and other commodities. We can also map the movement of craftspeople as well as shared ways of body adornment and potential amuletic practice and ask how, through cooperation, shared repertoires were renegotiated as these scripts developed. Craftspeople were active agents in these networks and may have included women, highlighting the family as a possible locus of innovation. Ultimately, this research reframes script development as a process embedded in craft networks, highlighting artisans, trade, and shared visual repertoires as key drivers. While more work is needed to explore the nature of graphic similarity across scripts and other craft traditions, I hope that I've shown that this approach moves us beyond isolated cultural models and toward a more interconnected view of early writing and glyptic interconnections in the East Mediterranean by centering the experiences of the individuals who crafted these communities into contact. Thank you.